And sometimes I'm asked to do projects a bit like this one for Rio, and this is one that's ongoing on a small island between England and France, Alderney. And the island is only very small. You can, it's about 2 or 3, 4 or 5 kilometers across. And I have placed 11 what I call stones. And these are compacted earth boulders. And in each of the boulder, there are different materials. And when they are now outside, so in this one had barbed wire, and then they were placed outside, and over the last year have eroded, and as they erode, this is the same one. They disgorge their materials into place. I love this. I love this so much. I now will do a project just about cows and the sculptures, and I could see this. They're so Henry Moore. I mean, it's a very beautiful organic form. So I think I must try and do a project where I have a series of the boulders and the cows, sculpt them, and then I'll bring them in for an installation, the cow stones. That's how it looked a week ago. And there is I personally don't have a website, but I made a project for this, a website for this project, which nobody knows about because it's called Alderney Stones, not Andy Goldsworthy. So, but it's got a whole project, and I designed the website and add to the website. So it reflects what's happening in this project. So maybe you should have a look at that. But and the island has a very dark history. It was occupied in the war by the Germans. There was actually a concentration camp there. 400 people died here. And this is a very important part of the history of the place, and a very difficult one to deal with. Difficult to know what to make in a place like that. You know, do I just ignore it, or do I make something for it? And if I make something for it, how do you deal with a concentration camp where 400 people die? So the stone that went here has poppy seeds planted inside it, and each year it grows red poppies. And I collected tools from all over the island, worn tools, things that people had worked with, and they were put into one of the stones. There's a bunker, one of the German bunkers, and inside there, people are eroding the stone through graffiti. And I also collected gloves from the floor where people had thrown their gloves away. The glove has the memory of the job the person had. It's the interface between the hand and the occupation that they were doing. And one boulder has lots of gloves in, which in the context of Rio becomes a little difficult too. The strange thing about this, I had this idea that the gloves would become more and more on the outside as the stone eroded. But people are always pulling the gloves out. They're always helping the hand out of the stone. So they're only 1 or 2 at any one time. So the work can go from something as formal as a boulder to just a throw. It can be as chaotic as a throw or as formal as the sphere. These are gloves, again, collected from a construction site in St. Louis, where I'm about to make a big sculpture in 2 weeks' time. But the human presence is always part of what I do. This is a frost shadow where I've stood still on a frosty day with the sun rising behind me until my shadow is left on the ground. And I have to stand there for quite a long time. And whilst I was standing there, the farmer was on his quad, you know, the four-wheel motorbike. He was going over the hills, and I knew he could see me. I was like a living Gormley, you know, just standing there. And he knew I was doing something. And he stopped off in the turnip field and then drove past me. He said nothing. He just dropped me 2 turnips on the ground. He just gave me the turnips and said, "How you doing, Andy?" and drove off. But the shadow, the human presence has, I think even from this is when I first began working in the 70s, I worked on a beach in Morecambe in Lancashire. It's north of England. And every day I passed the remains of a church where it had the graves carved into the stone. And there was always that sense of the stone having absorbed the body. And each time there was ice, I used to try and lift the piece of ice in the shape of the person and stand it up. It was never thick enough to do that. And when it rains, I do this a lot. As anybody who knows me, who have been with me, knows, when it rains, I lay down and then I get up. So how does an artist like myself deal with I work with nature, I'm interested in nature. How do I deal with somewhere like Rio? Well, I mean, nature for me is not just the bit of countryside that begins outside of the city. Nature for me is the city too. And I have to discover that in the city. And I think when Marcelo asked me to come to Rio, we went all around in the woods, in the mountains, in the city. And I think Marcelo was initially kind of surprised that I was more interested in the center of the city than the woods. But Rio has this powerful sense of nature in the city, more than any other city that I know. And I have worked in other cities. New York, I've been to. I don't know why I put that one in. Anyway, but maybe this is London. This was a project I did for a city, London, and I made, I think it was 11 snowballs, kept them in deep freeze, and on midsummer's evening, in the middle of the night, put them into the financial district of London. So people came into the city to find snowballs. So, New York. I guess Rio is a bit like New York in that laying on the ground in New York or Rio, no one cares. So it's a very easy place to make rain shadows, in certain parts of New York anyway, because there are some areas where Fox News is, where they own part of the pavement, and this is them evicting me from the pavement in front of Fox News' building. This was probably the 4th attempt at trying to get one done. I was particularly attracted to the red light that shone on it's difficult for you to see with the light, but I was wanting a red glow on the pavement. So imagine I lay down and it begins to rain, and because the rain's falling on the ground, the colour starts coming out of the ground, and I'm laying in the middle of this deepening red pool, and then I get up and leave this shadow. But unfortunately it didn't rain enough before they evicted me. But there is, there's little markers on the pavement that tell you where their building is and not. And so I thought I might do some projects where I lay half and half, or have my arm on their side. And when they tell me to go, I can just go like that. And in Rio, when I came, the first trip, it was quite wet, so I made several shadows. And I think that is one of my ways of trying to get to know a place, you know. Laying in the rain on the street is a good way to get to know the place. And I even made one here. And I think what I like about the shadows too, it's a sort of invocative of that, the way a city becomes ingrained with the memory of the people who work and live there. We all leave our memory. It's like you students that are here, you leave your memory here. You know, you leave it in the chair you sat in, the easel you worked in, the wall you worked against. And you can feel the memory and the presence of all the other students who came here. You know, I think that's a very beautiful idea. And of course, like Marcelo said about the powerful sense of, Rio surrounded by the woods and the forests, but it's also in the city. The forest is coming out of the buildings. This was a fantastic kind of idea. And I had a few possibilities for making works in the city. I even went back to Glasgow and did this one on a park in Glasgow. And typically for a project like this one, there'll be many ideas, and most of them never happen. But I love that sort of engagement with the place. And Marcelo is one of the most creative, dynamic people I've ever worked with. So it's a great opportunity. And Rio, too, is a very dynamic place to work with. This project is not about me using this as an opportunity to show my work here. It's an opportunity for me to create work here. This is a place to work against, work with, and to take up the challenge of Rio. And I think that's why I didn't want to get in the forest. I wanted to be in the city. Oh, and this was, Rio affected me all this year a little bit, and this was in Buffalo, New York, the steps to the museum. It's a temporary work. But the steps, the first time I went to the museum, the steps were in very bad condition, and they were just about to spend several $1 million repairing all the steps. So I came up with an idea to save them all that money. And the idea, well, this is how the steps were. They were all falling apart. So my idea was to, oh, bugger. Anyway, it's that way on. I have no idea how that happened. You know what I mean? How can you turn? Oh, sorry. Is that better? Thank you, Marcel. All right. Yeah, you can look at it that way. So it was a little tree would be planted on the steps in the middle of the beautiful entrance and have a little fence put round it, and eventually it would grow in 100 years' time to be this huge tree, this anarchic tree, right in the way of everybody. It would become the most famous tree in America, if they just had the guts to go with it, And they'd have saved millions of dollars on the repair work. It was genius, absolute genius. This kind of work probably wouldn't work in Rio because there's too many of these things going on everywhere. It has to be a place where nature has been kept a little in control, And eventually what attracted me, or the material that I decided to work with, was the clay. Not just because clay is part of the substructure here, and you have a very, at times, difficult and powerful relationship with clay, but I love the way you feel it in the decaying buildings. That the buildings, the brick buildings here, seem halfway between clay and building. And I love that state of material. There is, for someone like myself, for whom the process of growth, making and decay is important, I feel that very strongly in Rio, that there is this cyclical sense of things rising up and then decaying in a way that I haven't felt in many other cities. And that's not a derogatory thing. It's something that fits very comfortably with how I see the world. So I decided I wanted to work with the walls and to work with the clay on the walls, and had ideas about making clay walls in entrances. And I have, over the years, made installations where I've covered a wall with clay, like this one. This is the first clay wall that I did in San Francisco. This was in San Francisco about 10 years ago. And the idea was that it would crack and possibly fall off, probably fall off. In fact, it didn't fall off, and it's still there and has survived several earthquakes. Since doing this work, and this work did open up a whole heap of possibilities, I've made many clay installations and walls. And it's quite interesting to see the first one, because this is so precarious. It was a little out of my control, and that is reflected in the almost violent surface. I think later ones I've become very virtuosic with, but they don't have that kind of raw energy. I only realize that because of what I've done here in Rio, because I'm back to the raw energy bit. I always felt that there would be even though I've developed this whole way of putting clay on walls where it doesn't fall off, I did an installation in New York at Gallery Lalong a couple of years back, where the clay normally is mixed with hair, and I prepare the back and I rough up the back, and there's a whole kind of process. I did an installation in New York where there was no preparation other than putting clay onto the wall. So the installation started with an empty white gallery. Well, it was a bit damp. But as the clay dried, the whole room started collapsing in on itself. It was extremely beautiful and a bit disturbing, but it was very, very beautiful. And the clay is a white porcelain clay that comes into the city in great quantities as the things we eat of. Back at Rio, I was struggling with the idea of the walls, in that I wanted to penetrate the walls, to go into the walls somehow. And the black hole has reoccurred in my work since 1976. And this idea of entering the building somehow through the clay, through the brick, really appealed to me. These are the very first holes that I made as installations. This is in 1981, I think, at the Serpentine Gallery, and then a couple of years later outside of the Serpentine Gallery. I was very young then. The black of that hole is so deep and dark that people didn't believe it was a hole. And someone next to me who didn't know I'd made this particular work, I overheard this person say, "Do you know, when I first came in, I thought that was a hole." But the black holes were very much to look at, and I remember being inside the hole and that cutting away and being in there. So for Rio, I wanted to make something that people could enter, or I could enter the building, enter the brick. So I had this idea for a door that you would enter the building. And inside I would build a dome which would be covered in clay. So that was the idea that eventually we decided, Marcelo and I decided we would make. And then I had to figure out, I knew how to do the clay, but I didn't know how to do the dome. And I sent Marcelo this drawing about how I would make adobe bricks and make this dome and what have you. And Marcelo came to Scotland, and we were talking about how to make it. And then he said, oh, the Indians in Brazil, they make these wooden structures and they put the clay on it. And he showed me a video. And it was a very, very nice moment, because I took him into the studio and showed him this, which was another sculpture for somewhere else I was messing about with. And until then, I'd never combined those two possibilities. And that's actually quite important, because I think that when I come to somewhere like Brazil, I don't want to, I think out of respect for native cultures, I don't want to start appropriating or making the work too obviously, that making references like that too obvious. I think it was very beautiful that this happened coincidentally, much more powerfully because of that. And this is shows you a work that I made before then on the Met in New York. Then we had to decide on what wood to use, and I wanted to use old trees and whatever to make the dome with, because I have made huge versions of this. This is in the Palacio de Cristal in Madrid for the Reina Sofia. And all this wood was already cut and waiting to become paper or MDF. So I borrowed it for the installation. And part of the idea was to also remind people of how much wood comes into a city in the form of paper. And that's important to know about those things. Because people got very angry with me for bringing all these trees in. And I said, I didn't cut these trees, you did. But I wasn't able to use old timber here because of the possibility of termites, so we had to use a plantation-grown cedar. And if I was to do that, I wanted to be very careful about how much I use, because I'm very conscious about not wanting to use more than I need. So I made a very, unusually for me, it's a very precise maquette to determine how much wood I needed, and this is the structure being built in Rio. This was about 4 weeks ago. The first site that was selected was at a place called Utopia in the area of the boat. Yeah. And I have to say, I was okay with the site, but I wasn't 100% happy with it. It was in a fenced-off yard at the end of a building. The brickwork was okay, but it didn't have soul. The brick didn't have that kind of. And 1 week before I was about to come here to begin, they cancelled, and we lost our site. We had no site. And Marcelo, being Marcelo, got me another building. And I saw the photographs, and it looked fantastic. And in the end, it was even better. It's a place where people sleep and work on. It has a street life, you know. And I wanted the installation to have that sense of river of people and energy on the street. And then you go through the wall into this very quiet, intense space. So I was very, very happy with it. And because I wasn't able to come here to choose the precise location, I wasn't able to say, this is where the door goes exactly. I had to give it to Marcelo and his fantastic team to decide, which is a big deal because they cut through the graffiti. And I don't think that's something I could have done. And I'm very happy that it wasn't done by me, you know, because there's so many aesthetic decisions involved there that it was just a bit too much for me. So this doorway was cut in there. And then we had to find the clay. We went about an hour out of Rio to, where did we go? And we ended up in a brickworks. And this was fantastic. To see the clay just about to become brick, to become a building. That's a very powerful moment for a material. You know, it's still the earth, but it's about to become a building. So this is where I wanted to take the clay from. The clay was delivered, and we had a whole processing of drying. Unfortunately, it rained just before I came, so we had this whole drying out and process of crushing the clay. And then we added hay to the clay to make a fill in the structure. And then I hadn't taken into account how damp Rio is. You know, I thought Scotland was damp, but the clay wasn't drying out, and it got really heavy. Really heavy. It didn't, and so we had to put props to hold it up. And then it became like one of my ephemeral works, where I'm trying to figure out how to hold it and to work with it. It was alive, you know, it was really alive. And so we finished the whole thing with the clay and hair, and then I left it for 2 weeks to dry out. And came back, and we removed the supports, and it stood. So it was okay. Now on this trip, when I was away, I made this work in my house. This is, the reason I'm showing this is because the crew, this is the man who came to help me from my village. He's called Brian, and he is a plasterer. You know, he makes the plaster on my walls, and he's done my walls for years, but he also makes my clay works, because he knows how to, he's not frightened of big surfaces, and he can make a really nice, he can do what I cannot do with the clay at the end. But in between, he was working on my house. It was very strange to go from Rio with Brian to my house in Rio, and house in Scotland, and also to make clay work in my floor of my house too, which is now drying as I'm here. So I'll go back to see this work that's dried whilst this one's drying here. You know, I really like that. I will always look at this floor and remember Rio. That's a thought. So then we returned, this is a week ago, to put the final coat on. So we're covering the surface with a very smooth coat of clay and hair. And there's a whole process that goes on behind this work. Ultimately, I'm after something that is effortless. And it's so interesting you put so much effort into the work, then has to be removed. They have to take the effort out. And that's why Brian comes with me, because he can take the effort out of the clay. But just to let you know that we put human hair in the back of the clay to act as a kind of binder. There is human hair in the clay too. And that's a very effective way of holding the clay together, because you can't see it unless you look for it. And I also like that people are bound up in the work too. The crew that I had here are the best crew I've ever had anywhere in the world. I learned how to make sculpture, not really in the art school, but as a farm labourer, where I learned to work hard, to learn with rhythm, and to work all day long. And it's very important. And I love working alongside people that also have that sense of rhythm to the work. And these guys had an incredible rhythm. And some of the stories that were being told during the working process were relayed to me by Daniel, who was helping. And one of them, I think it was reported in the one paper today, when we'd made the wooden structure. They're always going on about what it reminds them of and something they had, a house or whatever. And this guy said it reminded him of a trap that he made to catch birds. And one of the other guys said, "How many birds did you catch?" He said, 25. And he said that he ate 24. And he said, "Well, why didn't you eat 25? He says, "Well, he left one in the trap to attract more birds." And the other guy says, "That's really cruel." And then he said, "It's more cruel to be hungry." These kind of conversations are going on. It was really quite extraordinary. And that work is ingrained in the tables. The tables absorb that work. So when it's finished, when the tables are finished, they don't know, but there comes a point when I know the work is all winding up and they're cleaning up, and I hover. I start hovering around the table. And then there's a moment where I say, "Stop, that's now art." And they're very perplexed. And I take the canvases, and I have a whole collection of canvases, and I consider these to be paintings, and they are landscapes of work. And they're very, very beautiful. And I love the way that one table had one purpose, and one table had another purpose, and that is reflected in the texture. So we finished the interior of the dome, so I had 2 or 3 days to watch the clay crack and to try and put heat in, put air in, to try and help the clay to dry out or to slow it down. So meantime, I started making work around the building, and this is the brick. The following day I made several. I love that kind of, you go there in the morning, and then at the end of the day, the clay wrapped around the brick cracked. So, and that's today's. I made this today. So there's a boulder in here which is cracking as we speak in the wall, unless someone's taken it. Yeah. It's such a great wall. I have got so many ideas for that building. So this is how it looks this morning inside the dome. Unfortunately, it's still sagging again. It's on the move. And so I had to put some more props up. When it dries, I still believe that it will be solid. And if it does succeed, which I think it will have that the loss of control that occurred during the making of it will give it a real energy. And I'm very excited about the final result. I'm very anxious too. And this is the crew. We had this is Bira, who is the kind of organizer of the crew, and this is Carol, who is here, and Daniel, who is here too. And really, it has been an absolute pleasure to have these people working with me. And it has been there's a huge amount of effort, huge amount of work gone into it. And the atmosphere, because I don't speak Portuguese, I don't necessarily hear what's being said, but I certainly feel the spirit of the conversations, the spirit of, in fact, you're more attuned to it possibly because I don't speak the language. And that energy, that engine of work that's been going on has kept me going to, and I thank these two and the crew so much for what they've done. And of course, Marcelo, who, as I said, this man is one of the most extraordinary men I've come across in the entire world. And that creative energy and that it's just been quite an extraordinary experience. So thank you very much, Marcelo, and your crew, and thank you all very much for listening. Thanks.